is that actually thinking comes in various kinds of degrees, and your thinking expands and becomes what I call hyper-thinking. Thinking can acquire extra dimensions to it that it simply cannot have within the material frame. And so as you expand your state of consciousness and your frame expands, your thinking can expand. It can turn into what I would call hyper-thinking. And now all of a sudden you can reason and think in, I would call hyperdimensional ways. And you can literally think things that are impossible to think in your current state of consciousness. And that hyper-thinking is a new dimension of intelligence that most of mankind doesn't know exists. It's a kind of thinking or intelligence that you would imagine an alien that is 1 million years more evolved than the human species, if we ever encountered such an alien and communicated with it somehow. It's the kind of intelligence that that alien might have. Like if that alien had a brain that was 100 times larger than ours, try to imagine what kind of intelligence they could have and what kind of ways of thinking. Like imagine an alien mind thinking in sort of hyper, in a sort of a hyper manner, like hyper intelligent. I'm not just talking about the difference between like 150 IQ points versus 200 IQ points. I'm talking about the difference between like 150 IQ points versus 1 million IQ points, like that level of difference. So imagine what a 1 million IQ mind could think. This would be a super intelligence that maybe you would only attribute to some sort of AI. You know, if we linked every computer on the planet together, every supercomputer, and somehow it turned into some sort of, you know, sentient AI or whatever, you know, in these sort of science fiction scenarios, you can kind of imagine how much smarter it would be than the average human, right? Well, the funny thing is that I've already accessed this intelligence, and you can access it too. The reason we're talking about this is because I want to help you to access this intelligence. It's fucking amazing to access this intelligence. You can access 1 million IQ points and see what that's like. You're able to think thoughts that are impossible to think in your current state of consciousness. Imagine a mind that's able to think like 100 different threads of thought at once and then interconnect them together. It's not just more thinking. It's not just faster thinking. It's a much more robust, higher bandwidth, multidimensional way of thinking. It's incredible. And it doesn't just scale linearly, it like scales exponentially. It's not just more thinking, it's a much higher quality thinking, and all the limitations of normal human thought, those are all transcended, and the thinking process itself becomes spiritualized. It's a mystical kind of thinking. It's rationality, but it goes beyond rationality. It includes rationality, it includes logic, but it becomes a sort of a hyper logic, plus it combines with visions, with mysticism. It all kind of combines together with a hyper intuitive understanding and just this profound intelligence. And so when your state of consciousness expands, your thinking expands, and all of a sudden shutting off your mind is no longer the goal. It's no longer desirable. You can think, and your thinking is so powerful that you can just cut through all the bullshit of normal human thought, and you can access spiritual truths that are impossible to access otherwise. And in fact, there are spiritual truths you could access through this, I'm going to call hyper-thinking, that you're not going to be able to access if you just shut off your mind and go into a meditative state like the Zen Buddhists do, which is one of the limitations and problems that I've always had with stuff like Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and so forth, where they teach you to just shut off your mind, is that, yeah, you can do that and you can access some cool states of consciousness and you can even have some awakenings, but you don't access hyper-thinking. And you might say, well, Leo, I don't need to access hyper-thinking. But you don't really know what you're missing until you access hyper-thinking. So some of the coolest, deepest insights require access to this hyper-thinking. Furthermore, some states of consciousness are so radical that they cannot even be remembered or explained to oneself. So there have been states of consciousness that I've accessed that are so radical that even as I sit here now, because my state of consciousness is lower than it was at that peak, as I sit here now, I can barely remember those states, and I can barely even explain them to myself, let alone to you. And that's astounding because it just shows you how crucial your state of consciousness is. My current state of consciousness does not give my mind enough bandwidth to access the deepest and most profound insights and thoughts that I've had. Even my memory in this current state of consciousness is not sufficient to hold truths and insights from those higher states of consciousness. My current state of consciousness does not allow enough bandwidth and memory for that. And it does not allow enough processing power and verbal communication power to even explain those states to myself. But I have, you might ask, well, then Leah, how do you know about it? Well, I have some very vague, fuzzy recollections of those insights and truths and states, but it's like very, very diminished. So think about taking an HD 4K image and then compressing it down into like a 6 pixel by 6 pixel square that's black and white. That's how much you can do that. You can do that compression process, but think about how much you lose going from a 4K HD image to a 6 pixel by 6 pixel image. That's kind of like how it works. And it's almost to the point where this little image, I mean, it's better to have this little 6 pixel by 6 pixel image than nothing at all, but it's so degraded that like you can't really, it has like almost no comparison. So much has been lost that you can't even really use that image to navigate in this ordinary life. It's insufficient to navigate. It's insufficient to really transform you. So part of what we're dealing with sort of a lack of bandwidth problem by sort of accessing these higher states of consciousness and coming back down to our normal states of consciousness. There's not enough bandwidth really. And so ideally what you do with spiritual work is you got to open up that bandwidth.